Sit back, relax, and welcome to Reading Hours. Today's book is The Forgotten Promise by Kate Hewitt. Please let us know in the comments from where you are watching, or if there is a book you want us to summarize in future. The wind carried the scent of salt and heather through the rugged cliffs of the Cornish coast, a place where time seemed to stand still. Emma Carlyle stood at the edge of the shoreline, her hands tucked deep into the pockets of her coat, staring out at the restless waves. She had not set foot in this place for over a decade, not since she had fled in the dead of night, leaving behind the only home she had ever known and the promises she had once sworn to keep. Now, with her mother gone and her childhood home left in her name, she had no choice but to return. The village had not changed much in the years she had been away. The narrow streets still wound their way between quaint stone cottages, and the bakery on the corner still sent out the scent of warm bread each morning. Yet, the moment she stepped through the door of her family's house, she felt the weight of memories pressing down on her. The air inside was heavy with dust and the faint remnants of her mother's perfume, a bittersweet reminder of all she had lost. As she moved through the house, her fingers trailing over the wooden banister of the staircase, her gaze landed on the sitting room fireplace, where a photograph rested on the mantel. It was of her and Daniel Tremaine, the boy she had once loved, the boy she had left behind. The sight of his face, frozen in time, sent a pang through her chest. They had made so many promises to each other in this very house, vows whispered in the hush of twilight, dreams spun from youthful hope, and she had broken them all. Her mother's solicitor had been clear. Emma needed to decide what to do with the house. Sell it, rent it, keep it. But none of those choices seemed easy. Standing in the empty kitchen, she traced the cracks in the worn wooden table, the same one where her mother had served tea and scones every Sunday morning. Could she really let go of all of this? A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. When she opened it, she found herself face to face with the very man she had been trying not to think about, Daniel. Time had changed him. His features were sharper, his once boyish smile now laced with something quieter, more reserved. His dark eyes searched hers, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "Emma," he said finally, his voice rough with something unreadable. "I heard you were back." She swallowed, her fingers tightening on the doorframe. Just for a little while. His gaze flickered over her, taking in the familiar features of the girl he had once known. "I wasn't sure if you'd ever come back." She hadn't been sure either. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Finally, Daniel shifted his weight, glancing past her into the house. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry about your mom." Emma nodded, a lump forming in her throat. "Thank you," he hesitated. "If you need anything, I won't," she interrupted, too quickly, too sharply. She saw the way his expression hardened, but he didn't press her. Instead, he nodded once and turned away, disappearing down the path before she could say anything else. Emma closed the door, pressing her back against it as she exhaled shakily. She had known this would be difficult, but she hadn't expected to feel the old emotions rushing back so fast. The past was a tangled web, and she had spent years trying to free herself from it. Yet, standing here in her childhood home, with Daniel's voice still lingering in the air, she wondered if she had ever really escaped at all. She moved to the kitchen window and watched Daniel walk down the path toward the village, his shoulders stiff. She remembered their childhood, the long summer days spent by the cliffs, the stolen kisses under moonlit skies. had dreamed of a future together, of leaving the village and building a life somewhere far away. But those dreams had shattered the night she left, and she had never looked back. Until now. Emma turned away from the window and moved upstairs to her old bedroom. The scent of old books and lavender still clung to the air. She ran her fingers over the wooden dresser, where a tiny jewelry box sat untouched. She opened it, revealing a delicate silver locket. Inside, a small picture of her mother and another of Daniel rested side by side. She closed her eyes as memories surged forth, her mother's gentle voice telling her stories, Daniel's whispered promises of forever. As she turned to leave, her foot caught on a loose floorboard. It creaked under her weight, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. Kneeling, she pried it open and gasped. Inside, a bundle of old letters lay neatly tied with a ribbon. Her heart pounded as she untied them and pulled out the first sheet. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. My dearest Emma, if you are reading this, then something has happened that I never wished for. There is something you must know. She stopped, her breath catching. Her mother had left her a message, something hidden away for all these years. With trembling hands, she unfolded the rest of the letter and began to read. Emma's hands trembled as she held the letter, her mother's delicate script bringing a flood of emotions crashing down on her. The words blurred momentarily as unshed tears welled in her eyes, but she forced herself to focus to read. My dearest Emma, if you are reading this, then something has happened that I never wished for. There is something you must know, something I kept from you in hopes of protecting you. But secrets have a way of surfacing, and now it is time for you to learn the truth. The truth. The very word made Emma's heart race. She scanned the next lines, her mother's words revealing a past she had never suspected. Many years ago, before you were born, there was a choice I had to make. A choice that shaped both our lives. It was not an easy decision, and I have carried the burden of it every day. But I had hoped that one day you would find your way back home, and when you did, you would understand. Emma's fingers clenched around the fragile paper. What choice? What had her mother done that had warranted hiding letters beneath the floorboards? She reached for the next envelope in the stack, barely noticing how her breath came in short gasps. As she unfolded the second letter, she realized that this was not written by her mother. The handwriting was different, more masculine, the ink slightly smudged. The date on the top caught her attention. It was from over 30 years ago. Dearest Margaret, I know I have no right to write to you, but I cannot let another day pass without trying once more. I should have fought harder for you. I should have defied them all. Not a day goes by that I do not regret losing you, losing us. I still hold onto the promise we made, that one day, no matter what, we would find our way back to each other. Do you still remember? Emma felt as if the walls of the tiny room were closing in around her. Her mother had been in love with someone else, someone she had been forced to leave behind. Had her father known? Had this man been her real father? Questions tumbled over each other in her mind, but no answers came. She shoved the letters back into the compartment, suddenly feeling as if she had intruded on something too intimate, too painful. The weight of her mother's past pressed against her chest, suffocating her. She needed air. Rushing downstairs, she barely noticed the cold wind that whipped against her face as she stepped outside. The village stretched before her, unchanged and yet suddenly unfamiliar. Had everyone known except her? Had Daniel known? Daniel, The memory of their brief conversation the previous day resurfaced. He had looked at her with something unreadable in his eyes, something guarded. Had he been keeping secrets too? She found herself walking toward the cliffs, where the waves crashed violently against the rocks below. This was where she and Daniel had spent countless evenings together, where they had dreamed of a future far from this tiny village. She hugged her coat tighter around her body as the wind howled around her. Emma. She turned abruptly at the sound of her name. Daniel stood a few feet away, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket. His dark hair was tousled by the wind, his expression unreadable. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice more breathless than she intended. "I saw you leave in a hurry. Thought maybe you could use some company." He studied her carefully. "Are you all right?" She hesitated. Should she tell him about the letters? About the man who had written to her mother all those years ago? She wasn't sure why, but she felt as if saying it aloud would make it too real. "I just needed some air," she said finally. Daniel stepped closer. "Emma, you don't have to pretend with me." Something in his voice, in the way he looked at her, broke through the walls she had tried so hard to rebuild. The weight of the letters, of the past she had never known, pressed down on her, and before she could stop herself, she whispered, "I found something. Letters from my mother, and from a man she loved." Daniel's expression darkened. "What kind of letters?" Emma swallowed hard. "Love letters, from before I was born. Daniel, my mother was in love with someone else." The words felt strange on her tongue, as if they belonged to someone else's story. "I don't know what it means. I don't know if my father knew, or if..." She couldn't bring herself to finish the thought. Daniel's gaze softened, and he reached out, touching her arm lightly. "I don't know what's in those letters, but whatever it is, you're not alone in this." She wanted to believe him, wanted to lean on him like she once had. But she wasn't the same girl who had left all those years ago, and she wasn't sure she could trust herself to fall again. "I need to figure this out," she murmured. "I need to know the truth." Daniel nodded slowly. "Then let's find it together." Emma looked up at him, searching his face for something: assurance, understanding, maybe even hope. And in that moment, she knew that no matter how painful the past was, she could not run from it any longer. Emma barely slept that night. The discovery of the letters had unraveled everything she thought she knew about her family, leaving her mind restless and filled with unanswered questions. She lay awake in the dim light of dawn, staring at the ceiling as the weight of the past settled heavily on her chest. She had always believed her mother to be a woman of unwavering devotion to her father, but now that belief had been shattered. Who was this man who had loved her mother so deeply, and what had driven them apart? By the time the sun had fully risen, Emma knew she had to take action. She had come back to the village to find closure, to make peace with the past, but instead, she had uncovered a mystery, and she could not simply walk away from it. The letters had called her back for a reason. She needed to find the missing pieces of the story. She dressed quickly and made her way to the kitchen, where the smell of fresh bread and tea greeted her. Aunt Sylvia was already at the table, sipping from a delicate porcelain cup, her sharp eyes studying Emma as she entered. "You look like you've seen a ghost," her aunt remarked, setting her cup down. "Bad dreams." Emma hesitated before shaking her head. "Not exactly. I found something last night." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the letter she had taken from the hidden compartment. She handed it to her aunt, watching as Sylvia's expression shifted from curiosity to something far deeper. Sylvia read the letter in silence, her fingers tightening around the edges of the paper. When she finally looked up, her eyes were filled with an emotion Emma couldn't quite place. "Where did you find this?" "In my mother's old bedroom, under the floorboards," Emma admitted. "There are more letters, from the same man. Do you know anything about him?" Sylvia sighed and folded the letter carefully, as though afraid it would crumble in her hands. "I had my suspicions," she said after a long pause. "Your mother was a private woman, but there were whispers. And now, I see that those whispers held more truth than I ever realized." Emma's pulse quickened. "Who was he?" Sylvia hesitated before finally answering. "His name was James Harrington. He was the son of a wealthy businessman, and your mother loved him more than anything in the world. But their love was not meant to be." Emma leaned forward. "Why not?" Sylvia's gaze softened. "Because James's family did not approve of Margaret. They saw her as beneath them, and they threatened to disinherit him if he did not end things with her. Your mother was heartbroken, but she knew that if she truly loved him, she could not ask him to give up everything. So she walked away, and he tried to fight for her, but in the end, his family won. He married someone else." Emma felt a lump form in her throat. "Did my father know?" Sylvia nodded. "Yes, he knew, and he loved her despite it all. He gave her the kind of stability and devotion that James never could. Margaret chose your father, but a part of her heart always belonged to the past." Emma sat back, her mind reeling. The love story that had remained hidden for decades was now coming to light, piece by painful piece. She thought of the man who had written those desperate letters, of the promises made and broken. And she wondered, was James still alive? Did he ever learn what had become of the woman he once loved? She glanced at Sylvia, determination settling into her bones. "I need to know more. I need to find him." Sylvia's expression was unreadable as she reached across the table and squeezed Emma's hand. "Then, I suppose you have a journey ahead of you, my dear, and I will help you in any way I can." Emma felt a flicker of hope amid the turmoil. The past was not as distant as she had thought, and now she was ready to uncover the rest of the story. The weight of her decision settled on Emma's shoulders as she prepared for the journey ahead. With Sylvia's help, she gathered what little information she could about James Harrington. The letters had provided glimpses into his past, but there were still too many unanswered questions. Where had he gone after losing her mother? Was he still alive? And if so, would he even remember the love he had once fought for? The first clue came from an old friend of Sylvia's, Mrs. Talbot, who had lived in the village for over 50 years. Emma visited her in the afternoon, the scent of lavender and aged books filling the cozy sitting room as the elderly woman poured them tea. "James Harrington," Mrs. Talbot mused, tapping a slender finger against her chin. "Oh, yes, I remember him well. A fine young man, though burdened by the expectations of his family. He left for America, you know. New York, I believe. That was many, many years ago." Emma's heart pounded. "Do you know why he left? Was it because of my mother?" Mrs. Talbot sighed, her gaze filled with a mixture of nostalgia and sadness. "He was heartbroken when she ended things. His family pressured him into marrying someone else, but I don't believe he ever truly loved her. He had a restless spirit, that one. I suppose he thought he could start anew in a place where the past could not follow." A spark of determination ignited within Emma. If James had gone to America, then that was where she needed to go. It felt daunting, traveling so far from home, but she had come too far to turn back now. The past was calling her forward, and she was ready to listen. Returning to Sylvia's house, she shared what she had learned. Her aunt, though hesitant, supported her decision. "It will not be easy," Sylvia warned, "and you may not find what you're looking for. But if this is something you must do, then you have my blessing." The next few days were a whirlwind of preparations. Emma arranged for passage on a ship bound for New York, packed what little she needed, and said her goodbyes to the village that had been her home for so long. As she stood at the docks, the salty breeze tangling in her hair, she felt a strange mix of fear and excitement. "Are you certain about this?" Sylvia asked, her hand warm against Emma's. Emma met her aunt's gaze, resolve shining in her eyes. "I have to know, Sylvia. I have to find him." With one last embrace, she stepped aboard, the wooden planks creaking beneath her feet. The ship's horn bellowed, signaling the start of her journey. As the shores of England faded into the horizon, she clutched the letters tightly in her hands. The answers lay ahead, across the vast ocean, and she was ready to chase them, no matter where they led. The journey across the Atlantic was both exhilarating and exhausting. The first few days passed in a haze of sea spray and the rhythmic creaking of the ship. Emma spent much of her time on the deck, staring out at the endless expanse of water, lost in thought. She imagined James as a younger man, full of hope and heartache, making this very crossing so many years before. What had been going through his mind? Had he truly believed he could leave his past behind? She found companionship in an elderly woman named Mrs. Harding, who was traveling to New York to reunite with her son. "A brave girl, you are," Mrs. Harding remarked one evening as they sat together, wrapped in shawls against the chill. "Traveling all this way for answers." Emma offered a small smile. "It doesn't feel brave, it feels necessary." "That's what bravery is, my dear, doing what must be done, even when it frightens you." As the days stretched on, the ocean grew more turbulent. One particularly violent storm had passengers clutching their bunks in fear, the ship rocking wildly on the angry waves. Emma fought nausea and anxiety, gripping the letters tightly as if they could anchor her. When morning finally arrived and the storm had passed, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The worst was behind her. The only way now was forward. At long last, the towering skyline of New York City came into view. Emma stood at the railing, her breath catching as she took in the sight of so many buildings rising against the horizon. The harbor buzzed with activity, ships arriving, people shouting in a chorus of different languages, the scent of salt and industry mingling in the air. This was a world unlike anything she had ever known. Disembarking was a chaotic affair. Immigration officers checked paperwork, families were reunited with joyous tears, and hopeful newcomers stepped onto American soil with dreams gleaming in their eyes. Emma clutched her small bag, her heart pounding. She had made it this far. Now she had to find James. Her first destination was an address she had found in one of the letters, an old boarding house in the Lower East Side. It was a cramped and noisy part of the city, bustling with life in a way that made her both nervous and exhilarated. The building itself was weathered, its brick facade darkened by years of soot and rain. Taking a deep breath, she knocked on the door. A woman in her 40s answered, her eyes sharp with curiosity. "Help you, miss. I'm looking for someone who may have lived here some time ago. James Harrington." The woman frowned, rubbing her hands on her apron. "James Harrington? I remember a James. Quiet fellow, kept to himself. But that was years ago. Haven't seen him in a long while." Emma's heart sank. "Do you know where he went?" "Last I heard, he was working down at the docks. might still be there if he hasn't moved on again. It wasn't much, but it was something. Thanking the woman, Emma set off toward the waterfront. The streets were overwhelming, filled with shouting vendors, clattering carriages, and a sea of people all rushing toward their destinations. But she forced herself to focus, clutching the worn letters in her pocket as if they held the key to her next steps. Reaching the docks, she inhaled deeply, steeling herself. The journey that had begun with a handful of forgotten letters had led her across the ocean to this very moment. James Harrington was somewhere in this vast city, and she would not stop until she found him. As she stepped onto the wooden planks, surrounded by the scent of brine and the sound of waves lapping against the hulls of great ships, Emma knew one thing with certainty: her journey was far from over. The sounds of the docks filled Emma's ears, the clatter of crates being stacked, the shouting of workers calling out instructions, the distant hum of ship horns echoing through the city. She stood still for a moment, taking it all in, searching for a sign, a familiar face, anything that would bring her closer to James Harrington. The task seemed insurmountable. New York was a world unto itself, vast and teeming with lives as tangled as the streets that wove through it. Taking a steadying breath, she approached a group of dock workers, men with calloused hands and weathered faces who eyed her with mild curiosity. Summoning her courage, she stepped forward. "Excuse me, sir," she addressed the nearest man, his face shadowed under the brim of a cap. "I'm looking for someone who may have worked here, James Harrington." The man exchanged a glance with his companions. "Harrington? I knew a Harrington. Used to unload cargo here, but that was years back." Emma's pulse quickened. "Do you know where he went?" The dock worker scratched his chin, considering. "Last I heard, he was working at a warehouse near the Bowery. Didn't speak much, but he was a hard worker. One day, he just stopped coming. It wasn't much, but it was something." Emma thanked him and set off toward the Bowery, weaving through the bustling streets, past market stalls overflowing with fresh produce, past newspaper boys hawking the latest headlines. The city had an energy all its own, relentless and electric, but she had no time to admire it. She was chasing the past, unraveling a promise left unfulfilled. The warehouse stood on a quieter street, its brick walls stained with years of soot and grime. She stepped inside hesitantly, the air thick with the scent of burlap and sawdust. Men bustled about, hauling sacks of goods onto carts, their shouts mingling with the scrape of wooden pallets against the floor. Emma spotted an older man behind a desk, tallying numbers in a ledger. "Excuse me," she began, approaching him. "I'm looking for a man named James Harrington. I was told he worked here some years ago." The man looked up, his gaze assessing. "Harrington, you say? I remember him. Came in every day, did his job, never spoke much of his past. Then one day he was gone, didn't say where he was headed." Emma's heart sank. Another dead end. She fought against the creeping despair that threatened to overwhelm her. Did he leave anything behind? Any address, a friend he might have confided in? The man rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. There was a fellow he spoke to now and then, Daniel Byon. Ran a pub on the Lower East Side. If anyone knew where Harrington went, it'd be him. Hope flickered in her chest once more. She pressed the name to memory and made her way toward the Lower East Side, the streets growing narrower, more crowded. The scent of roasting chestnuts and fresh bread mingled in the cool, evening air as she reached the pub. The place was lively, filled with the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses. She stepped inside, scanning the room until her eyes landed on a man behind the bar, polishing a glass with practiced ease. He looked to be in his 50s, his once dark hair streaked with gray. Taking a deep breath, she approached. "Are you Daniel Byon?" The bartender looked up, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly. "Who's asking?" "My name is Emma," she said, gripping the edge of the bar. "I'm looking for James Harrington. I was told you might know where he is." Byon stilled for a moment, then set down the glass. "Harrington, eh? Haven't heard that name in a long time." Emma leaned in, desperation creeping into her voice. "Please, I need to find him. It's important." The bartender studied her for a long moment before sighing. "Last I heard, he was working at a print shop, midtown, but he never stayed in one place too long." A print shop, another lead. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She thanked him and hurried out, weaving through the crowded streets once more, the city stretching before her like an endless maze. The hours ticked by as she followed each lead, only to be met with more questions. The print shop had closed months ago, the owner unaware of where James had gone. She asked in coffee houses, at boarding houses, even at a tailor's shop where someone thought they'd seen him once. Each clue led her in circles, and the exhaustion was beginning to wear her down. Just as she was about to lose hope, a young newsboy tugged at her sleeve. "Miss, you looking for James Harrington?" Emma's breath hitched. "You know him," the boy nodded. "Saw him couple of weeks ago. Comes by the park sometimes, sits on the same bench, always looking lost." Her heart pounded. Which park? Washington Square. Without a moment's hesitation, Emma rushed toward the park, her pulse thrumming in her ears. Dusk had settled over the city, casting long shadows across the cobblestone paths. She scanned the benches, her eyes searching, hoping. Then she saw him. An older man sat hunched over on a bench, his hands clasped before him, his gaze distant. His once dark hair was streaked with silver, his shoulders slightly bowed with age, but there was no mistaking it. James Harrington. Emma took a steadying breath, then stepped forward. "Mr. Harrington." The man looked up, his deep-set eyes studying her with a mix of curiosity and wariness. "Who's asking?" She swallowed the lump in her throat. "My name is Emma. I believe you knew my mother, Margaret." His eyes widened, his breath catching in his throat. For a moment, silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words, the weight of years pressing down. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Margaret." Emma nodded, her heart aching at the pain and longing in his expression. "She kept your letters. She never stopped loving you." James exhaled shakily, running a hand through his hair. "I never stopped loving her either." Tears burned behind Emma's eyes as she sat beside him. "She wanted to find you. She never got the chance." James looked away, his jaw tightening. "I spent my whole life running from the past, and now it's caught up to me." Emma reached into her bag, pulling out the worn letters, placing them in his trembling hands. Then stop running. For a long moment, he simply held them, his fingers tracing the faded ink. The past had finally found him, and with it, the chance for redemption. As the last light of day faded from the sky, James Harrington opened the first letter, his eyes filled with the memories of a love that had never truly been lost. As the days passed, the weight of the past bore down heavily on Alina. The discovery of the letters had stirred something deep within her, a longing to understand, to piece together the fragments of a love story lost to time. She had spent every evening in the dim glow of her bedside lamp, reading through the letters over and over, each word carrying the echo of emotions long buried. It was as if she had stepped into another world, one where love had been real, fierce, and fragile all at once. She had not spoken to anyone about the letters, not even to Daniel, whose presence in her life had grown increasingly significant. There were moments when he seemed on the verge of revealing something, but then he would pull back, retreating into himself. Alina understood the hesitation. She had been doing the same. They were two people standing at the edge of a truth, afraid of what lay beyond. One evening, as the wind howled outside and rain pattered against the windows, Alina sat in the small study with a cup of tea, her fingers tracing the faded ink of yet another letter. The words spoke of devotion, of a love that had been meant to withstand the odds. But there was also a tone of finality in the writing, a hint that fate had intervened, separating two souls who had once dreamed of a life together. A knock at the door startled her. She glanced up, her heart pounding, and saw Daniel standing there, his expression unreadable. He hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. "You've been distant," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Is something wrong?" Alina set the letter down and sighed. "There's something I need to tell you." She gestured for him to sit, and as he did, she unfolded the truth, the letters, the name that had appeared in them, the love story that had been cut short by forces beyond control. Daniel listened in silence, his eyes never leaving hers. When she finished, he exhaled slowly, as if absorbing the weight of what she had just revealed. "There's something I haven't told you either," he said finally. "Something about my family, about why I came back here." Alina's breath hitched. "Go on." Daniel hesitated, then reached into his coat pocket, pulling out an old photograph. He handed it to her, and as she took it, her eyes widened. The faces staring back at her were unfamiliar, yet oddly familiar at the same time. A man and a woman stood side by side, their smiles tinged with something unspoken. And then she saw it, a small, barely visible detail in the background. The very same locket that she had found among her grandmother's belongings. A chill ran down her spine. "Daniel, who are they?" He swallowed hard. "They were my great-grandparents, and I think they're connected to the people in your letters." Alina stared at him, the implications sinking in. The threads of the past were weaving together, pulling them into a history neither of them had fully understood until now. "This can't be a coincidence," she murmured, running her fingers over the photograph's surface. "There has to be more to this." Daniel nodded. "I think so too. That's why I came back. My mother told me stories about our family, about a love that never should have been, and the secrets that followed. She didn't know the full details, but she always said that someone was wronged, that there was something unfinished. And then I found this photograph. It led me here." Alina's mind raced. What if the letters weren't just a glimpse into a tragic romance, but a key to something greater, a promise that had never been fulfilled, a past that still longed to be uncovered? "Do you know their names?" she asked, holding her breath. Daniel took a deep breath. The man's name was William. Alina's heart pounded. That name, it was the same name from the letters. She felt as though the past had reached out and grabbed hold of her, refusing to let go. "What about the woman?" she pressed. Daniel hesitated. "I don't know. My mother never told me, but I have a feeling you might." Alina swallowed hard, her mind flashing back to the delicate script in the letters, the way the author had written about her beloved William with such reverence and sorrow. She had assumed the writer was someone distant, someone who had existed in a world separate from her own. But what if she was wrong? What if the woman in the letters was more closely tied to her than she had realized? Without a word, she rose from her chair and crossed the room, pulling the small wooden box from its place on the shelf. She hesitated for only a moment before opening it, lifting out one of the letters with shaking hands. She handed it to Daniel. "Read this," she said softly. Daniel unfolded the fragile paper, his eyes scanning the words carefully. Alina watched his face as he took in the emotions laid bare on the page, the aching love, the desperation, the sorrow. When he reached the end, he looked up, his expression filled with something she couldn't quite place. "This is incredible," he whispered. It's like a part of my own family's history that I never knew existed." Alina nodded. "It feels the same for me. My grandmother never spoke of this, but I know she was connected to it somehow." They sat in silence for a moment, the storm outside rattling the windows as if nature itself was urging them to keep searching, to keep digging deeper. Finally, Daniel spoke again. "If we put everything together, your letters, my photograph, the stories we've both heard, we might be able to find the truth." Alina's heart swelled with determination. "Then that's what we'll do. We'll find out what really happened." And for the first time since finding the letters, she felt a sense of purpose, a feeling that she wasn't just uncovering a forgotten love story. She was fulfilling a promise that had been waiting for generations to be honored. The morning air was crisp as Alina and Daniel stepped outside, the weight of their newfound connection pressing upon them. The storm from the previous night had cleared, leaving the sky a piercing shade of blue, but the lingering dampness in the air mirrored the uncertainty in Alina's mind. The letters, the photograph, the shared history, it was all too much to be mere coincidence. Somewhere in the past, their families had been bound together, and the echoes of that bond had brought them here, to this moment. Alina clutched the wooden box tightly as they walked toward the town's historical archives. If they were going to find the truth, they needed records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, newspaper articles. Anything that could confirm what their hearts already suspected. The small research building was nestled between a row of aging stone storefronts, its entrance marked by a modest brass plaque. Inside, the scent of old paper filled the air, and the quiet hum of a ceiling fan added to the sense of stepping back in time. The clerk at the front desk, an older woman with wire-rimmed glasses, peered at them with mild curiosity as they approached. Looking for something in particular, Daniel exchanged a glance with Alina before speaking. "We're researching our families, trying to trace back a connection we think might be here." The woman nodded knowingly. "You'd be surprised how often people come looking for the past," she said. "It has a way of calling to us when it's time to be remembered." She gestured toward the back of the room. "Records are organized by surname and decade. You'll find birth and marriage records in those cabinets, newspaper archives on the microfilm." Alina offered a grateful smile before leading the way. She could feel Daniel's steady presence beside her as they combed through the records, their fingers trailing over yellowed pages, their breath hitching each time a familiar name appeared. After nearly an hour of searching, Alina let out a quiet gasp. "Here," she whispered, pulling a brittle sheet of paper from its folder. "Look at this." Daniel leaned in, his eyes scanning the document. It was a marriage certificate, dated nearly a century ago. The names leaped out at them: William Harrington and Margaret Sinclair. Alina's throat tightened. Margaret, she murmured. Could she be the woman who wrote the letters? Daniel traced the delicate ink with his finger. It's possible. If my great-grandfather was William, and this is his marriage certificate, he paused, shaking his head. But if they were married, why would the letters sound so heartbroken? What happened to them? Alina's mind raced through the possibilities. A love that was lost, but not forgotten. A promise that had been made, but never kept. She thought of the final letter, the one that had carried such a weight of sorrow. They needed more. Together, they turned to the newspaper archives, scrolling through decades-old articles on the microfilm machine. Alina's eyes scanned the headlines: births, deaths, war reports, until suddenly she stopped. Daniel. Her voice trembled. He looked over her shoulder, following her gaze. The article was dated only a few months after the marriage certificate they had found. Tragedy strikes young couple William Harrington reported lost at sea. A sharp breath escaped Daniel's lips. Lost at sea. Alina read aloud, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions within her. William Harrington, son of Henry and Elizabeth Harrington, was aboard the cargo ship Alina May, which departed from London last Tuesday. The ship never arrived at its destination, and reports suggest it was lost in a sudden storm. Authorities presume all aboard to be deceased. Harrington, newlywed to Margaret Sinclair, leaves behind a grieving widow. She turned to Daniel, her mind spinning. This changes everything. Daniel swallowed hard. If William was lost at sea, Margaret must have been devastated. That would explain the letters, the sorrow, the unanswered questions. He ran a hand through his hair. But if that's true, how does my family fit into this? My great-grandfather had children. If William never returned, how? He stopped abruptly, a new thought striking him. His gaze darkened. Unless he wasn't lost forever. A shiver ran down Alina's spine. What do you mean? Daniel's expression was grave. What if he survived? The thought settled between them like an unspoken secret. What if William Harrington had been presumed dead, but had somehow made it back, years later, when it was too late? What if Margaret had grieved him, believing he was lost forever, only for him to return to find that life had moved on without him? Alina felt a deep ache in her chest. If that were true, if William had survived only to find that the woman he loved had been forced to let him go, then the pain in the letters suddenly made even more sense. We have to find out, she said firmly. Daniel nodded. Let's look for him. If he lived, there has to be another record of him somewhere. For the next 2 hours, they searched tirelessly, combing through every record they could find. The weight of time pressed down on them, each document revealing fragments of a life that had once been whole, but was now shattered by history's cruel hand. And then, finally, another clue. Daniel pulled a document from the stack, his breath catching. Alina, look at this. She turned to him, and the moment her eyes landed on the paper, her heart nearly stopped. It was another marriage certificate, but this one was dated nearly 10 years after the first, and the groom's name was unmistakable: William Harrington. The bride, however, was not Margaret Sinclair. Alina's fingers trembled as she read the name of the woman who had married William all those years later. It was Daniel's great-grandmother. A silence stretched between them, filled only by the rustle of old paper and the hum of the archive machines. Alina's mind reeled. If William had survived, if he had come back and found Margaret gone, had he simply started over? Had he carried his heartbreak into a new life, leaving the past behind? Daniel exhaled slowly. So he lived, but he didn't go back to her. Eleanor's heart ached for the love that had been lost, for the promises that had been broken, whether by choice or by fate. But now they had their answer. She looked up at Daniel, and in his eyes, she saw her own feelings reflected: sorrow, understanding, and something more. The weight of history had settled between them, but so had a new kind of connection. "This isn't just about the past anymore," she murmured. "It's about us too," Daniel nodded. "Then let's see where it leads." And as they left the archives, stepping back into the crisp autumn air, Eleanor knew that this journey wasn't over yet. The truth had only just begun to reveal itself. The weight of the revelation settled between Eleanor and Daniel like an unspoken secret. William Harrington had survived. He had returned, only to find Margaret lost to him, and he had started a new life with another woman, Daniel's great-grandmother. The truth had unraveled before them in brittle documents and faded ink, but the emotions behind it felt as raw and real as if they had lived it themselves. Stepping out of the archives, Eleanor drew in a deep breath, the autumn air crisp against her skin. "What now?" she asked quietly, unsure of where they should go from here. Daniel stared ahead, his jaw tense. "I don't know," he admitted. "I thought knowing the truth would bring closure, but it only raises more questions." He glanced at her. "Do you think Margaret ever knew he came back?" Eleanor had been wondering the same thing. If Margaret had believed William was dead, had she moved on? Had she ever learned that he had survived? Or had she spent the rest of her life grieving the man she thought she had lost forever? The ache in Eleanor's chest deepened at the thought. "We have to find out," she said firmly. Daniel nodded. "But where do we even look?" A thought struck Eleanor, and she turned back toward the archive building. "The letters. What about them?" "They were never sent," she said. If Margaret had written them, if she had poured her heart out but never mailed them, then maybe she didn't know he was alive. Daniel considered that for a moment. Or maybe she did know, but it was already too late. Eleanor shivered at the possibility. Either way, there has to be something more. Maybe there are more letters, ones she did send. If we could find her later correspondence, we might know what happened to her after William disappeared from her life. Their search took them back to the old estate where they had first discovered the letters. The house, with its weathered facade and air of forgotten history, seemed almost to welcome them back, as though it had been waiting for someone to unearth its secrets. Inside, they returned to the attic, where dust motes danced in the golden light streaming through the small, circular window. The old wooden chest still sat where they had left it, and Eleanor felt her pulse quicken as she knelt beside it once more. She ran her fingers over the lid, hesitating before lifting it. The scent of old paper and time itself greeted her, and she carefully sifted through the contents. They had already found the unsent letters, but was there more? Then, at the very bottom, beneath a stack of fragile sheets, her fingers brushed against something different, a small leather-bound journal. "Daniel," she whispered, pulling it free. He crouched beside her, eyes locked on the aged book in her hands. "That looks personal." Eleanor opened the first page, her breath catching at the delicate cursive that filled it. The name inscribed at the top was unmistakable. Margaret Sinclair. The journal was hers. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she flipped through the pages, scanning for anything that might hint at what had happened to her after William's disappearance. Most entries were filled with mundane details, notes about the weather, mentions of family visits, reflections on daily life. But then, she turned to an entry dated nearly a year after William's reported death. I dreamed of him again last night, William. He was standing on the shore, calling my name, but when I ran to him, the tide carried him away. I wake each morning with the same ache in my chest, knowing I will never see him again. The days pass, but the pain does not lessen. They tell me to move on, to find someone else, but how can I? My heart belongs to a ghost. Eleanor's throat tightened as she read the words aloud. Daniel exhaled slowly. She never knew. Eleanor shook her head. Not then, at least. She truly believed he was gone. She turned the pages, scanning for later entries. As the months passed, Margaret's writing shifted, still filled with sorrow, but tinged with acceptance. She spoke of finding small joys, of trying to rebuild her life. And then, nearly 2 years after William's disappearance, Eleanor found an entry that made her heart stop. I received a letter today from someone I never expected to hear from. William's mother. She asked to meet. She says she has something to tell me. My hands shake as I write this, for I cannot imagine what it could be. Eleanor and Daniel exchanged a glance, their hearts pounding in unison. She must have found out then, Daniel said. Eleanor nodded. But what did she do with that knowledge? They turned the pages faster now, eager to uncover the rest of the story. The next entry was written in uneven, hurried handwriting. I saw him, my William. He is alive. He stands before me, and yet he is a stranger. He did not come back for me. He has built a new life. He looks at me with sorrow, but there is no undoing the past. I should feel anger, I should scream, but all I feel is emptiness. The man I loved died long ago, even if his body still walks this earth. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the book. Margaret had found out. She had seen him again, but it had been too late. The final entries in the journal spoke of resignation. Margaret had chosen to move on, though her heart had been broken beyond repair. There were no more mentions of William after that. Instead, she spoke of finding solace in her work, in friends, in small moments of peace. Eleanor shut the book, her chest heavy. She let him go. Daniel was silent for a long moment before he spoke, and he let her go too. They sat in the attic, surrounded by the remnants of a love story that had never truly found its ending. It was bittersweet, knowing the truth, yet understanding that some wounds could never be healed. Daniel reached for Eleanor's hand, his touch grounding her. We've spent so much time searching for their past, he said quietly. But what about our future? Eleanor looked at him, seeing not just the man beside her, but the history that had led them to this moment. The weight of the past no longer felt like a burden, but a bridge, one that had brought them together. She squeezed his hand. Maybe it's time we write our own story. As they left the attic, stepping into the light of the afternoon sun, Eleanor knew that while the past had shaped them, it did not have to define them. Some promises faded with time, but others were waiting to be made. And this time, they would not be forgotten. Eleanor sat by the window of her cottage, the faded pages of Margaret's journal resting in her lap, her fingers trembling as she turned the next page. The air outside was crisp with the onset of autumn, leaves swirling in golden flurries beyond the glass. Yet Eleanor was scarcely aware of the changing season. Her mind was consumed by the words of a woman who had lived and loved more than a century before. Her heart still aching across time. The weight of Margaret's sorrow pressed heavily on Eleanor's chest, and she exhaled slowly, steeling herself for what was to come next. The latest entries recounted the final days of Margaret's time in Whitby, how she had clung to hope that William would return to her. But hope had been a cruel companion. William had indeed survived, yet he had not sought her out. He had not returned to fulfill their promise. Margaret had eventually left Whitby, carrying with her a broken heart and an unanswered question. Why had he abandoned her? Elinor closed the journal for a moment, staring out at the waves rolling against the shore. The sea had borne Margaret's sorrow for over 100 years. And now, as Elinor traced the words inked by Margaret's hand, she felt that sorrow as though it were her own. But what had truly happened to William? Why had he vanished from Margaret's life after surviving the shipwreck? A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. Daniel stood there, his expression uncertain, as though he were bracing himself for an argument. Their last conversation had left things unresolved between them. Elinor's insistence on the past conflicting with Daniel's growing desire to focus on the future. Yet despite the unspoken tension, he had returned. "Any new revelations?" he asked, glancing at the journal in her lap. Elinor nodded. Margaret left Whitby. She believed William had survived but never came back for her. She hesitated before adding, "I don't understand it. If he loved her as much as he claimed, why would he let her go?" Daniel sighed, stepping inside. "People don't always make the choices we expect them to. Maybe he had his reasons. Reasons that don't make sense." Elinor shook her head. "It's not just about them anymore, Daniel. It's about us too. About what this means." Daniel's gaze softened. He had seen how deeply Elinor had become entangled in the past, how much Margaret's story had come to mirror her own fears about love and trust. And despite his initial reluctance, he understood now that this was more than just a historical mystery to her. It was personal. "I found something," he admitted, pulling a folded letter from his coat pocket. "At the library, an old archive. It was never published in any official records, but it mentions a William Davenport." Elinor's breath caught. She took the paper from his hands, unfolding it carefully. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. It was a notice from a solicitor dated decades after Margaret had left Whitby. William Davenport, it stated, had died an old man in a house by the sea. He had never married. And more importantly, there was mention of a letter found among his possessions, one addressed to Margaret Addison, but never sent. Elinor's heart pounded as she met Daniel's gaze. "There's a letter," she whispered. He nodded. "If it still exists, it could explain everything." They wasted no time. The notice had referenced an estate in a small village further down the coast. It was a long shot. Decades had passed, and if the letter had survived at all, it would be buried deep within forgotten archives. But Elinor had come this far. She wasn't about to turn back now. The journey was filled with quiet anticipation. Daniel drove, the roads winding through cliffs and countryside, while Elinor clutched Margaret's journal to her chest, drawing strength from the woman who had loved and lost before her. When they arrived, the village was smaller than Elinor had expected. Its cottages clustered close to the sea, weathered by salt and wind. The house they sought was now owned by a local historian who was intrigued by their request, but uncertain whether anything remained from William's time. "There are old belongings in the attic," the woman offered. "You're welcome to look." Elinor's hands trembled as she sifted through the dust-covered boxes. The attic smelled of time itself, of memories sealed away and long forgotten. She brushed away cobwebs, feeling a strange sense of familiarity, as though she had walked this path before. And then, Buried beneath faded papers and brittle books, she found it, a single yellowed envelope, sealed but never delivered. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she let the weight of it settle in her hands, the final piece of a puzzle she had spent so long assembling. Daniel stood beside her, waiting, knowing she needed a moment to absorb the significance of what she held. When she finally broke the seal and unfolded the fragile paper, William's words leapt from the past, his voice reaching across time. My dearest Margaret, if you are reading this, it means that time has passed, and perhaps we are both different people than we once were. I wanted to write sooner, but fear held my hand still. Fear that you had moved on. Fear that I was no longer the man you once loved. I never meant to leave you without a word. When I was found, barely alive, I was taken far from Whitby, my recovery slow and uncertain. By the time I had the strength to return, I had convinced myself that you would be better without me. That perhaps you had already found happiness, and I had no right to take it from you. But I have never stopped loving you, not for a single day. If I were braver, I would have come back. But cowardice is a terrible thing, and it has been my companion for too long. I can only hope that wherever you are loved and cherished as you deserve to be. Forever yours, William Aliner let out a shuddering breath, tears slipping down her cheeks. Margaret had never read this letter. She had died never knowing the truth that William had loved her until the end, but had been too afraid to seek her out. Daniel's hand found hers. Now you know, he murmured. She nodded. The past had given up its secrets at last. Margaret's love story had not ended the way it should have, but at least now it had an ending. And perhaps, in understanding their story, Aliner could finally make peace with her own heart. As they left the house, the wind carried the scent of the sea, and for the first time in weeks, Aliner felt lighter. She had found what she had been searching for, not just the truth, but the strength to embrace the present. And in that moment, she knew. The past would always be a part of her, but it no longer had to define her future. Aliner stood in the quiet English countryside, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on her like the mist rolling over the fields. The past had unraveled itself before her in ways she had never imagined. And now, standing on the threshold of closure, she felt an unexpected sense of peace. The discovery of William's unsent letter had been both a revelation and a heartbreak. It had answered so many questions, yet it also left her grappling with the reality of what had been lost to time. She found herself drawn to the small cemetery where William had been laid to rest. The wind whispered through the trees as she knelt before his grave, the letter in her hands trembling slightly. The words he had written, the promises he had intended to keep, resonated with her in a way that nothing else had. It was a love that had never faded, a connection that had transcended years of silence and misunderstanding. Reading his words aloud, her voice faltered. I never forgot, Aliner, not a single day. The truth of those words filled her with an ache that was both sorrowful and beautiful. For so long, she had carried the burden of believing she had been abandoned, that William had chosen duty over love without regret. But now she knew the truth. He had fought for her in ways she had never realized. Life had been cruel, twisting their fates apart, but love had remained, undiminished by time or distance. As she sat in quiet reflection, she thought of what this journey had given her. She had come seeking closure, answers, and perhaps a way to move forward. What she had found was something far deeper, a connection not just to William, but to her own past, to the woman she had been and the woman she had become. She had been shaped by love and loss, by war and survival, by the strength of the promises she had once made. Returning to the manor one last time, Elinor walked through its halls with a sense of finality. It no longer felt like a place haunted by ghosts, but rather a space filled with memories, both painful and precious. The echoes of the past would always linger here, but they no longer held her captive. She knew now that it was time to let go, to allow herself the freedom to step into whatever future awaited her. As she prepared to leave, she glanced one last time at the rolling landscape beyond the windows. It was not just a place of sorrow. It was also a place where love had once flourished, where laughter had once filled the halls. And that, she realized, was what she would take with her. Standing at the gate, she took a deep breath and stepped forward. The past would always be a part of her, but it no longer defined her. William had kept his promise in the only way he could, and now, at last, she was ready to find her own way forward. The forgotten promise had been remembered, honored, and set free. And with that, Elinor walked toward the future, carrying love, loss, and the quiet strength of a heart that had finally found peace.